It's spooky season, everybody, so we wanted to use this as an excuse to talk about horror in fighting games. It's not exactly a common sight or a genre that people associate with one another, but you might leave this video having learned that the connection is actually more common than it seems. We have quite a few interesting examples prepared for you, but before we start going over them, it's important that we establish what horror even means. There are three major distinctions here. Horror as an emotion. Without additional context, horror is first and foremost a feeling associated with intense fear and a sense of shock. It typically describes things that go beyond a simple scare, something deeply disturbing and unsettling. Horror as a genre. This word serves as a perfect descriptor for a genre of fiction that typically aims to frighten and terrify the viewer in some way. Some do it by presenting hideous creatures with sudden jump scares, while others might try to get under your skin in a more subtle way. Since its inception, horror has branched into multiple subgenres like body horror, gothic horror, slashers, found footage, and more. Horror as an aesthetic. Lastly, decades upon decades of horror fiction have established a distinct enough imagery that it has become a visual aesthetic of its own. It includes anything you'd typically associate with horror fiction. Blood, bones, monsters, skeletons, occult signs, creepy abandoned buildings, and so much more. While the horror aesthetic and fiction go hand in hand, one can still exist without the other. To use video games as an example, we need to look no further than Doom. The most recent Doom Eternal title features many visual staples of horror. There are entire levels filled with demonic creatures, flesh-infested concrete, occult pentagrams, and copious amounts of gore and viscera. And yet, there's not even a hint of fear or tension. Instead, you get an exhilarating rampage full of ripping and tearing. Now, take a second to decompress, because suddenly switching to Doom 3 might give you whiplash. It's not just the visuals this time. Doom 3 is a full-on horror title that tries to make you feel vulnerable and afraid. The game is coated in layers of darkness and creepy sounds. They wanted to make you feel like you're never safe. Now, with all that established, for today's video we shall present you with a detailed, but by no means exhaustive, list of all the different forms in which horror peeks through in fighting games. From simple designs to overall style and narrative elements. Let's get to it. Starting with something simple, Tekken is a nice example of how horror imagery can be used very selectively for the sake of underlining or highlighting unusual characters or their traits. Going as far back as Tekken 1, we have Devil Kazuya. With that kind of name, it's not hard to understand what he represents, and in Tekken 2, it provides a stark contrast between the rest of the game and your final showdown with the devil. Even the stage was suddenly surrounded with complete darkness and a series of screens or projections that made it feel more unsettling. Future games followed a very similar idea. True Ogre, Unknown, Jinpachi, Azazel. All of them had creepier designs and darker stages than what could be found in the rest of their respective games. By using the visual language of horror, the developers were able to underline bosses as something special, evil, and out of this world. It's no surprise then that Soul Calibur, something of a sister series to Tekken, used the same method with its boss fights, often making you fight the monstrous nightmare or skeletal inferno within their own chaotic, surreal stages. So, what if you took the same concept and instead of characters you applied it to the world building? Well, you'd get Guilty Gear. Not that there isn't any horror material within the characters. Zato is quite literally a living corpse. Faust looks more terrifying than ever in Stride. Raven is an immortal masochist with an impaled head, and the list just goes on. And yet, the backgrounds of Guilty Gear typically allow themselves to overshadow the characters when it comes to the horror imagery. And it does a great job of showing the complicated settings where beautiful gardens and cities are neighbored by hellish landscapes, occult rituals, and gigantic beasts. Or their remains. Even Strive, with its bright colors and mostly gorgeous backdrops, doesn't shy away from showing you a valley full of long-dead giants, or absolutely unnatural environments where Gothic cathedrals warp and shift like waves in baleful sanguine pools. There is a stark contrast between stages like those and Illyria or Skyrim, but that is exactly the clash of tones that makes the world of Guilty Gear so curious and captivating. Now, by combining all of those methods, we get a game that is completely rooted in horror aesthetics. By far, the greatest example of this is Darkstalkers, a series of fighting games where almost every character is based on classic movie monsters, folklore creatures, and other evil beings. Vampires, golems, zombies, mummies, and werewolves. They've got them all. Naturally, it wouldn't make sense to hold fights amongst these legendary creatures in normal locations, so there's plenty in terms of otherworldly battlegrounds. There is one stage in particular that beats them all, and remains shocking to this day. Fans will assuredly already know what we're alluding to. The Fetus of God, a surprisingly straightforward name for a stage that is all sorts of twisted. Belonging to the demon Jeddah, this stage puts us inside a uterus with a gigantic demonic baby. Judging by the looks of it, whoever is fated to lose during this fight will simply become a source of nutrition for the growing abomination. The other stages are not this dark, however, and largely represent the environments that could relate to each warrior. One of our favorites is a stage that sets the fight along the side of a skyscraper, not only underlining the supernatural origins of the fighters, but also providing a highly unusual perspective that we never see in fighting games. The classic monsters and cemeteries definitely set the mood for Halloween, but sometimes horror is just about cool shit. You know what we're talking about. The metal covers, the slasher flicks, creature features. Even though the horror aesthetic is associated with something disturbing, who doesn't think the alien looks cool as hell? Every time a new Saw movie comes up, we're curious about what gruesome trap they thought of for this most recent installment. And let's be honest, nobody watches Friday the 13th for the sublime writing or complex characters. Mortal Kombat as a franchise excels at going for cool horror. If you played this game as a kid, chances are you had a moment where you sat down to try and find the inputs for all the over-the-top gore-fueled fatalities. And you probably ended quite a few matches with a down 2 that sent the opponent plummeting onto the spikes. To this day, whenever a new Mortal Kombat comes out, a compilation of fatalities gets millions of views. Because it has the exact same appeal as those new Saw traps, or Jason's 10 new ways to get rid of pesky teenagers. Hell, Jason even made it into the Mortal Kombat franchise itself, along other horror icons like Freddy, Bubba, and the aforementioned alien along with his friend, Predator. And the stages? Well, they were always rather good at the creepy stuff, but it peaked with Mortal Kombat 11. Look at the Sea of Blood with splashing waves and a giant fish carcass. Deadpool is more disgusting and visceral than ever. How about the chitin layer with its enormous dead bug, nasty flesh, eggs, and burst shells? This stuff is amazing. We've listed many examples that pertain to the visuals, but you might be wondering, what about the horror stories in fighting games? Unfortunately, that's not exactly a common sight, even among games like Darkstalkers or Mortal Kombat, where it would make a lot of sense. But we still have a few notable examples. The first one takes us way back to the 90s, into an era where you could get excited about Bloody Roar getting sequels, unlike, well, today, where you can't even really hope for a spiritual successor. Anyway, the setting of this series is rooted in horror, with a classic evil organization kidnapping zoanthropes, people who could turn into animals and conducting experiments to turn them into brainwashed super soldiers. The character backstories are unexpectedly filled with tragedy, but it goes beyond that in showing some brutality, even in the endings. It is especially clear in Shen Long's Bloody Roar 2 ending, where he simply disembowels himself in front of Long, the man he is a clone of. When it comes to Melty Blood, the horror elements are lighter individually, but more thorough. As a spin-off of Tsukihime, it carries the same brand of supernatural thriller. When the night has come and the streets are empty, the world of Melty Blood teems with murders perpetrated by dead apostles, vampires, and other forces of evil, with these monstrosities in turn often hunted by equally mysterious agents of the church, magicians, or gifted humans. However, there is a lesser-known indie fighting game that also fits this description. The story of the Black Heart might not be incredibly complex, but it is a remarkably complete mix of all the previously discussed horror elements. Every facet of the presentation, from music to special moves, maintains the dark tone you would expect from the genre. As our last game, we can't help but mention what might be the definitive horror game, Terror Drome. Now, this game started out as an utter copyright nightmare. With Mortal Kombat-style gameplay as the foundation, the small indie team created the ultimate game for horror fans, letting you fight against Jason, Bubba, Ghostface, and even some deep cuts like Maniac Cop or the Tall Man from Phantasm. Despite its jank, the sheer amount of passion and the fun concept made it a cult classic. And it is currently being reborn with a cast of urban legends like Bloody Mary and Wendigo, alongside characters like Dracula and Frankenstein. Characters no longer burdened by copyright. We hope you enjoyed this peek into the many different forms that the horror genre can take when adapted into fighting games. Despite covering quite a few titles, there's a lot more out there, so we'd be happy to see your comments about your favorite examples. As always, thank you for watching all the way to the end, and see you next time.